So yesterday, a tweet popped up on my feed. There was somebody asking whether people had experience being outsider scientists, especially in the field of neuroscience, because he needed some information for his upcoming talk. And before I knew it, I started responding. I guess I had a lot to say, ended up writing 3 tweets because of the limitation of the words. And then when I read back, I realized that if somebody read this without context, they would probably feel like the tweets kind of sounded bitter. And it was a great lesson for me because I really didn't want it to come out that way. But honestly, I felt like maybe there is some truth in it. Because when you try to do stuff from outside of the scientific community, it becomes a little bit tricky. And so I ended up deleting all those tweets because I really didn't want this to be misinterpreted. However, the greatest lesson for me was that the fact that when you are trying to do something that it's probably out of the box, it's actually important to get out of the already established community, because what happens is that those thoughts and those ideas and those opinions, etc., they tend to influence what you are working on. And so myself, that's one of the main reasons I pulled myself out of institution and also corporations, because I felt like it had the potential of getting influence, and I really didn't want this work to be influenced. Much of the content that I have in this channel is my own research mashed up with other scientific work, obviously, because that's what you do in literature review, you build up on it. But also a big part of it is the hypothesis, the intuitive findings, if you will, that you tend to get once you do enough research in a field, once you are submerged in one field, because you come to a point where you also start getting those sort of, gut. They call it the researcher's gut feeling, and part of it is that. And those are the parts that I cannot prove yet, because they need to be much more research if you want to do it scientifically. But nonetheless, I am here to share them with you because it is part of the consolidation work that I'm doing. But it's very important to think about how thoughts influence, because they create this magnetic field around whatever the community is. And interestingly, I also, another feed popped onto my Twitter about a very respectful also scientist, but in social sciences, who kind of said the same thing. And I also got very excited to hear him, because he's like, I don't care about my peer, I don't care what they think about, because once one idea is set, then people run with it and it just sort of expand, and God forbid if that idea is totally wrong. And most of the time it is, because it's either polluted by politics or funding or ego, etc., you name it. And so because I've seen it enough when I was in institution, when I was working in institution, and also when I was in corporations, I really wanted to kind of get independent from that, because I did not want any of my postdoctoral work be influenced by any fundings or any politics or any ego or anything like that. And so the parts that I'm presenting to you, part of it is what I've done in my own research, but also parts of it is the intuitive sort of, they call it the research gut feeling that you get. And those are messages that I wished I could prove, but I can't do it right now, but I'm working on it for future. all this brings me to the topic that I wanted to share with you today. It's very common and totally established in the current traditional neuroscience and psychology that there is a thought and there is an emotion. And as we already talked, most of the current body of knowledge when it comes to both neuroscience and psychology, anything that has to do with brain, it's all research on the physical brain. The non-physical brain, as in brain waves, has got very little attention. And if you are one of those scientists who want to kind of veer off and focus on that, you get either laughed at, or you don't get funding, or they just kind of put you in a corner to be limited to just those, for example, 5 categories, but you can't really go any further. And so as a result, there are certain opinions that are formed based on just examining the physical brain. And those ideas, people will take it and they run with it, and it sort of becomes, after a while, household knowledge, if you will. And it's very seldom that we sort of step back and say, okay, let's think about it, because once it becomes household knowledge, it's very hard to kind of travel back in time to figure out how that knowledge actually came about, because it might have been polluted with a lot of these stuff that I already mentioned. And also, we don't step back to look at, okay, this knowledge came about just by examining the physical brain, but there's much more to the brain than we know today. And one of those understanding / structure of the brain that is a household knowledge today is that there's a thought and there's an emotion. And I have researched and pondered upon this for many, many years. I started this work in 2012, but obviously prior to that I was thinking of it as well, and I never understood the exact difference. And that difference became even more revealed to me when I started studying emotions and how other scientists have defined emotions. And so in the study of emotions, when you look at it, and there's a lot of research, brilliant scientists who've done this, they basically have categorized emotions into 2 big categories: continuous versus discrete. But when you look at the continuous, the researchers have been counting many emotions, and they are not just your typical emotions, for example, be it sad or being angry, but there are a lot of nuances. That's why they call them continuous emotions. And if you look at it, I think at one point I read that there's like 4,000 plus emotions that scientists have counted. And then I started my own research in my own lab, and part of it was to control and manipulate the subject's emotions, because I wanted to see how they react to certain things, if they were, for example, in positive states as opposed to in a negative states. And very interestingly, that is when I was able to firsthand see what a research study that would focus on that would entail. And because it was my own, I was able to, and here is what I found in my own research, in my own lab. At the frequency level, there is no difference between a thought and an emotion. Absolutely none. In fact, they both interact and collaborate with each other, because that's how it is elicited, it's emanated, and that's how it works. So when you look at the brain waves, and when you are in lab and when you're manipulating certain behavior of the subjects, essentially the readings that you see from different various frequencies, they are obviously different based on the person, but there's absolutely no difference between when a person is thinking or when a person is emotional. let's put that aside, that finding aside, and think about how we have come to understand emotion and name it, etc., in the world of science. Traditionally speaking, in the world of science, STEM, if you will, and of course neuroscience, there are much more, it's very male dominated traditionally. I mean, obviously it's much better now within the last 10 years, but a lot of these studies, they actually emanate from 40, 50 years ago, and they were all male. And what is the connection or relationship between men and the word of emotion? It's pretty crappy, if you ask me, because every single time you talk about emotions, the first thing that your traditional household belief thinks is that it's women that are emotional. And so one thing I noticed in the field of science was that every time you studied, for example, emotion from the scientific perspective, it was almost as if it kind of looked different upon. It was as if, the male dominated scientists wanted to explain brain more at a logical level and then emotion differently. This is only my hypothesis, that is one of the reasons these two became separated in the field of neuroscience and psychology for that matter as well. Having said that, it's very interesting because more modern science shows that the brain is not logical. It is actually emotional. Just think about, for example, how many pairs of shoes a man or a woman has. Doesn't matter about the gender, but if you have more than, let's say, a couple, those were emotional purchases. Or when you look at the science of marketing, most of the marketings today, they appeal to people's emotions. And that's because the purchases we do are emotional, the decisions we make are emotional. I mean, look at the car industry, for example. They really don't sell cars, they sell emotions. Talking about cars and driving, think about the road rage, most of which research shows that they are male dominated, or domestic violence, which is also an emotional act. Most of them are conducted and done by the male population. And so if you think about it that way, the two really are not separate. They are part of it. And when you look at it from a science perspective, in the lab, at the frequency level, and that's where all the things are happening, they are the same. Thoughts worth mentioning is that when you look at the map of continuous emotions, the ones that I mentioned that they have been counting up to 4,000, there is a map that there are two axes, at least for now, that scientists have categorized these different emotions. And these are developed by Schrerer et al., if you want to look it up. And if you look at it, a lot of these, because it's continuous and because there are so many different nuances, they actually become more of a state of being, more so than emotion, for example. For example, one of them is that the feeling of satisfaction. When you're thinking of something, how would they've named it, for example, the feeling of satisfaction or content, etc., etc. And so it becomes less of an emotional category, but more of a state of being, which then talks more into what I just said about what I found in my research, that at frequency level, they are both the same. And so my hypothesis is that a thought cannot exist without a state of being / emotion, if you want to call it, and a state of being cannot exist without a thought. And these are all at the frequency level. And if you think about it that way, you see how we have missed it, just because traditionally in the field of neuroscience and psychology, we have been focusing primarily on the physical brain. We're thinking frontal lobe and occipital lobe and hippocampus, neurotransmitter, etc. All fine and dandy, but we miss the holistic picture, which is also adding brain waves or frequencies to these. And this all brings me back to what I was trying to say in the beginning, that what if our understanding of the brain and of the psychology of human being has been so conditioned to how people thought 50 years ago, and at the moment all we're doing is that we're just continuing with the same effort. And that's why we need those outsider scientists who kind of break away from the traditional norm for them to be able to do research at a more independent level. A few of them were able to do it. For example, I'm a huge fan of Pribram, who have introduced, or with Bohm as well, Dr. Bohm, the holistic mind, thinking about the brain really at a holistic and holographic level, I should say. I'm sorry, holographic mind. Did I say holistic? Holographic mind. The holographic mind, and the way they presented it is that it very matches with, if you think about the brain also at frequency level. And as I've said many times in the past, there is a wealth of information in the wave, in the ether, if you will, because how else are we able to communicate? How else does information travel between us into, you know, our node of whatever we have, the brain, the cells, and etc. And so it's very important to not forget that portion of the human existence and human body and human brain and human cells, because they're all connecting at the frequency level, which is at the atomic and subatomic level, is electrons and quanta, which we're all made of. So if for the next gen neuroscientists we can bring these two entities together, that a thought is not different than emotion and emotion is not different than thought, they're both the same entity, and because they cannot exist without each other at the frequency level, they're both the same, then imagine what discoveries we'll be able to do and have of the human brain in the future. Because if you think about thought and emotion and human brain at the frequency level, then the findings we will have, it'll just be endless, because there's just so much to be found, because the current body of knowledge and the current science in research results are very limited. They are not really covering everything that exists, especially if you think about the human mind as this holographic mind that I mentioned, or anything more than just the physical. Because one of the main reason the current, I hope it all made sense to you. If you have any questions, as always, just leave me a comment. But I'm really hoping that with these type of thoughts we could explore more and kind of break away from the norm, and for the next generation neuroscientists to be a little bit more sort of independent from the systems and kind of break away from it. And that's one of the reasons, for example, I went into Bitcoin, because I really wanted to stay away from be able to fund myself such that I was not focused or dependent on the system, so much so that it would influence this work. Because when you want to break out of whatever the norm is, you really need to have, you need to be in a position where you're kind of free from the institutions. So that's all I had for today. I have much more to say, but I need to kind of become a little bit more courageous and come out of my shell and share these things publicly, because I think it's important that we kind of force ourselves to get out of the shell and think a little bit out of the box, and or whatever you want to call it, and expand our minds, especially for the future of humanity, so that we could be in a much more servitude and be much more, I think, in a better position to present the real research and findings and discoveries, as opposed to just one-sided, if that makes sense. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.